So yeah, just take care of each other, be safe out there, whether you're going to work, whether you're going to school. It's, it's not always safe. All right. So, in that happy note, what sort of God lets this happen, huh? What sort of God are we talking about? I know, right? So thank you for working with me, not being able to meet you at the end of last week or at the beginning of this week. I hope that the recordings that I had were a little bit helpful, as well as the media. And the PowerPoints. The PowerPoints are the big, if you haven't figured that out, those are the that's the money resource right there. But yeah, so I do want to give us a chance to answer any lingering questions we also may have had from last week, right? So we introduced the different attributes of God. We went through the whole list and we talked about a number of the problems that are going to come up with those. And some ways some philosophers potentially can try to address them. But we didn't get into, each of the assigned readings, full on. So if there are any lingering questions about that, or we can jump right into this week as well, right? Talking about arguments for this kind of God's existence, right? This kind of God being the one with all the omnis that we talked about before, right? Including omnibenevolence, which it turns out is going to be a really important one. So we're starting off with questions. Questions, anything from last week or this week? Great question, Toria. Great. Okay, so as we get into arguments for God's existence this week, again, remember vocab is a big thing in this class. And so these are terms that come up when we study epistemology, right? So not only are we talking about metaphysical arguments here, right? Metaphysical arguments about what exists, there is an epistemological element about what we can know, right? Because it's hard to talk about what exists if you can't first know that that thing exists, right? So there's knowledge and what is real. There's often going to be an overlap here. And so that's where these terms come up. These are Latin terms for how we come to know things, right? So the idea is that there are traditionally two ways we can conceive of knowing something or acquiring knowledge. And so the Latin roots here are going to be really helpful to you, because all these distinguish between is whether or not we have to have experience in the world before we know something. So the a priori, prior to experience. That means that according to those arguments that employ a priori statements, right? Statements that can be known prior to experience, right? That means that those types of arguments don't rely on empirical evidence, right? They're just relying on things like definitions of terms, right? We can just conceptualize and use reason alone to arrive at God's existence from those arguments. Whereas a posteriori, right? Yeah, Maggie, it's great to learn Latin, right? It really makes a lot of things make sense, right? So post meaning after. So a posteriori truths or statements can only be known after you have experience in the world, right? So the classic example of two different types of statements like this, right, is the difference between the statement, all bachelors are unmarried men, and I don't know who's a compelling bachelor these days. I used to go to George Clooney was my stand bachelor. who's the running bachelor these days? Anybody? Bachelorette? No celeb crushes? Okay, we're making someone up. Toby. Toby's a bachelor. All right, these are two different statements, right? Two different propositions. And we can assess or come to know the truth value of each of them, right? And so the question is, how would we come to know the truth value of each of these statements? What type of knowledge would we have to have? Okay, so who thinks they know which of these statements is known a priori versus which one of these statements is known a posteriori? Excellent, right? We can know that it is true that all bachelors are unmarried men prior to experience in the world. I do not have to go out into the world and check all the bachelors, right, to make sure that they're unmarried, because it's just something that is true by definition, right? Now, there are going to be limits to this type of knowledge, though, and this is going to come up when we get to ontological arguments for God's existence, right? Those are the type that rest on a priori statements. And this critique is going to come from David Hume, who says, like, look, that's great, I can learn about words when we are talking about a priori statements, but it doesn't tell me anything about the world, right? I don't know anything about whether there are bachelors. I don't know how many of them are, who the bachelors are, right? Which leads us then to the Toby is a bachelor. That's very clearly an a posteriori statement, right? We can't know if that statement is true without going out into the world and figuring out whoever this Toby is, right? And checking to see whether or not they satisfy the criteria. Are you a man? Which is, again, now this day and age, if you are in the UK, that just changed, right? The legal definition of, right? So even determining gender, right? We can't agree on that, let alone, right, with they're unmarried. Okay, so very, very different types of things. And so the idea is that, again, we can categorize types of arguments for God's existence based on what type of premises they use. Okay, so some types of premises are going to be a posteriori, which means, hey, we need evidence. We need to have seen something in the world to then reason to God's existence, right? Whereas the a priori arguments are very unique because they don't rely on any empirical evidence, right? We can reason to the existence of God just by definition. That's a really great question. I think I would need to know more about the methodology he used to arrive at those.
Okay, so his five axioms, they're just very simple
Is it just mathematical
assumptions,
truths?
applied truths.
I think that would all count as a priori because they're being derived from mathematical truths, right? So it's not telling us anything about points that really exist in the world, right? Or what the distance is, right? They're merely equations, they're formulas. And so one helpful way of understanding this is if we talk a little bit about Plato's metaphysics. And so if you're interested in exploring this, I would recommend you look up the allegory of the cave, which is an allegory or a metaphor for these degrees of reality and different ways of knowing things. And so he has a great way of framing where mathematical truths lie on that hierarchy, right? And so the idea is the story is you're starting off in a cave and the things on the walls are shadows, but the people who are trapped in the cave think they're the most real, right? But the idea is that there are more real things, things that are outside of the cave. And one of the things that's supposed to represent the most real thing is the sun, but we can't look directly at the sun right when we emerge from the cave, right? It will blind us with its light. So what we do is we look at the reflection of the sun in the water. That for him, the reflection of the sun in the water for him is mathematical truths, right? Like a formula that's trying to represent laws of nature, right? Absolute truths in the world that we're trying to capture. It's just a reflection of it though, right? It's not it's the thing itself, right? It's like a tool we use to understand that thing. So yeah, if you're interested in some of those delineations between types of a priori knowledge, but mathematical truths, things that are true by definition, those are all going to be a priori. But the question is then, do they tell us anything about the way the world actually is? Other questions so far? And again, we can also go back to attributes for God's existence, right? If anyone's still unclear about what type of God we are potentially arguing for the existence of. Right, so one noteworthy point for all of the arguments that we're going to be looking at, right? And this is going to be for the next few weeks, right? So this week we're just covering the cosmological type arguments. Next week it'll be teleological and ontological arguments, but then we also still have arguments for miracles, right? We have the problem of evil. So we're going to be talking about God's existence for weeks and weeks to come, right? Lots of different arguments to explore, but you do get a little bit of a showcase, like an introduction, exactly like you were saying, David, about how we can sort of categorize them, organize them in our minds, right? Because again, even when it comes to one type of argument, there's going to be lots of varieties of those, right? So like just with Aquinas, how many different ways did he formulate the cosmological argument? How many ways? Five, yeah, right? 5 ways again, like Euclid's 5 axioms or whatever, right? So there, again, how can we recognize patterns? What makes them cosmological arguments, right? And so that's what we're going to highlight in the coming weeks is how we can identify certain types of arguments. And why is that useful, right? Well, because we do encounter variations of these arguments every day in our normal lives, right? So if you ask people why they believe in God, sure, some of them might have like more psychological explanations, like, well, I was raised in a family that, like this is literally an explanation of how I got my beliefs. But then you might ask them like why they think those beliefs are true, right? And that's where these reasons come in. And so some people might give you some version of the unmoved mover, right? The uncaused cause, or like we'll see next week, the intelligent designer, right? So there are versions of these arguments that actually rationalize and justify people's belief in the existence of these types of beings, right? So if we're going to engage with those beliefs, it helps us to understand what type of argument it is, right? What are the defining features? And then as we're going to see, what are some potential weaknesses with those, right? So then you can form your own opinion, if you'd like, about which types of arguments are the strongest, right? Which types of arguments have more of a success rate in showing that God exists. And something else that we're going to see as we move through this class is that it's not just going to be metaphysical arguments. We're going to dive more later on into the term into religious epistemology. So you're going to see that philosophers have sort of left this debate that we're engaging with right now aside. Like you don't see a lot of philosophers still arguing about whether or not God exists. Instead, and that I think has more to do with the fact that we're so empirically minded these days, we have trouble when our theories don't meet where our technology can actually test it, right? So we're dealing with unverifiable, untestable things, and you can't prove something doesn't exist. So like that just makes that debate really hard to continue, right? So we're learning the history of that debate. But the current debate is actually about whether or not it's rational to believe in God or a God, given the lack of evidence, right? So it'll be interesting to see how the conversation has shifted, but we want to know what these arguments are, right? Because again, they do actually still motivate a lot of beliefs, right? So the cosmological arguments that we're going to be looking at have three main features. Okay, so they're going to start off with that a posteriori observation, right? And it can be different ones, right? We're going to see Aquinas goes through a couple of different ones, but it's always an a posteriori observation. Okay, so cosmological arguments always are based on something that we know from experience. Okay, and this typically involves something about the notion of contingency. So here again, terminology, vocab words. And we talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about the attributes of God. Remember, what type of being is God supposed to be? Anyone remember? It exists. Not naturally. It has to exist. What's another way of saying it? That it has to. It must. So God's existence is supposed to be necessary. Cosmological arguments are based on some variation of an observation of the world that it is contingent, right? So we're observing some facet of the world or many facets, right? Depending on what the observation is. But the idea is that we are observing the contingency of the universe, okay? So cosmological arguments all start off with an a posteriori observation, typically about the contingency of the universe, right? And the reason that's important is, again, because by definition, right? So then once we observe that, then we can use other types of reasoning, right? By definition of contingency, a contingent being requires something outside of itself, right, to have created it. And so that's where we can start to see the progress of the argument, okay? So that definition of contingency after an observation of contingency allows us to start going back through a chain of cause and effect. Here is the second facet of all cosmological arguments. They tend to involve a denial of an infinite regress of those causes. Okay, so an infinite regress is the idea that something could go backwards forever, right? And so cosmological arguments rest on a really important presumption, which is that infinite regresses are impossible, right? So that is a big presumption that we will have to evaluate, right, when evaluating cosmological arguments. What reason do we have to think that that chain of causes cannot go backwards forever? Why does it have to have a starting point, right? And it's a very compelling argument, right, that we're going to see. We're going to especially focus on it in Aquinas's third way, because he uses a very important strategy, argumentatively, that we're going to use in our papers later on in the quarter, and that is called reductio ad absurdum, which is just more fancy Latin for reduce to absurdity. Okay, so this is the idea. It's a way of arguing for something by assuming the opposite of what you want to prove, sort of like the Socratic method, right? Like, I'm going to start off by agreeing with you, and then we're going to see how what you think leads to something absurd. So it turns out that we were originally wrong, right? That's sort of the strategy here. And so, in order to argue for the existence of a necessary being, Aquinas very strategically uses a reductio. He says, let's assume there are no necessary beings. Let's assume it's only contingent beings all the way back, right? What is the ridiculous, absurd conclusion of that, according to Aquinas? What would be the case now if there were no necessary beings? If it was just contingent beings forever all the way back? Could there have been a first contingent being? That's right. And so if there is no beginning, would there be anything that exists now? Really, we exist, exactly, right? So this is the crux of Aquinas's reductio, right? The idea that from the contingency of the universe, logically speaking, right? So even though we're starting off with an a posteriori observation, right? There's still a priori reasoning involved afterwards, right? We're using a lot of logic, a lot of inference, right? But the idea is that we can come to a proposition that, again, once we check with our experience, we know is clearly false, right? And so then we must go back and reject that assumption, right? Not all beings are contingent. There must have been at least one necessary being, and then Aquinas just cracks me up. And this we all understand to be God.
The first cause argument.
Yeah, it's God, right? So yeah, that's we call this, or I call this the natural theologian jump, because we don't clearly all understand. Like, there are lots of ways we could understand that necessary being. I'm sure you have already figured that out, right? But the natural theologian jump is to say that as soon as we argue that a necessary being exists, we're done. We've proved God exists, right? So the question for you is, do you think that that necessary being has to be God? Because as we're going to see from Bertrand Russell in his critiques, perhaps it's just the universe, right? And not God. Maybe the universe exists necessarily, and that was the first thing, right? Something like this. So there are lots of ways we can address each of these points, right? But so we have that a posteriori observation of contingency. We have a denial of infinite regress, right? And then we have the jump from necessary being to God for Aquinas. So questions about this overall pattern that we're seeing? We're getting laundry and stuff everywhere. Okay, so now let's go into what his 5 observations are. And the reason that I'm doing this is I don't want to confuse you, but technically not all of the 5 ways are cosmological arguments. The 5th way is actually a version of the teleological argument we're going to see next week about intelligent design, but it has the same structure as the others, right? With the denial of infinite regression. So we're counting it here, right? It's following that structure. But technically it's not about the first cause. It's about a very perfect being, right? Perfectly intelligent, harmonious being. So yeah, the last one is a little bit more teleological, but they do all follow that same pattern. But let's make sure we know what each of the 5 observations are. So for those of us in the PowerPoint, this is on slide number 9. What are the different observations, a posteriori observations that Aquinas made about the world? We already know number 3 was contingency. Mention number 5 was harmony. So I'll take any of the other 3. Okay, excellence, Toria. That is, I think, what you mean by perfection, excellence. That's the fourth one. Yeah, good, right? And so this is the idea again that if we have a notion of perfection, right, clearly there has to be something more perfect, right? Perfection is a matter of degrees, right? So here again, we observe that we use the concept of perfection even without having anything perfect in our physical lives. So there must be, right, degrees, a highest thing, something that is the most perfect. Again, infinite regress, it can't go on forever, right? There can't always be a most perfect thing, although again, perhaps we can question that, right? Perhaps we can, and we'll see this a little bit when we get to the ontological argument, right? Can you imagine like a more perfect island? Can you imagine a more perfect God? Right? They're like maybe always a little bit more we could add. But the basic idea is that presuming perfection doesn't just go up infinitely in terms of degree, there has to be a most perfect thing, and that we all understand to be God. Good. Right? So in terms of perfection, what else? So we've got 3 through 5, so we're missing the first two. Motion, good, right? So not only do things exist contingently, but the things that exist contingently move, right? And from what we know from science, right, we know that that motion has to be created by something outside of itself, although that too is now being challenged by what we've learned from quantum physics, right? So there are lots of entities that maybe just pop into existence or that move in ways that are unpredictable. But typically, right, again, our experience indicates that motion is moved from one body of mass to another, right? So again, no denial of infinite regress. There has to have been a first mover. And just like with contingency, that first mover has to be different from everything else, right? Otherwise, it too would require a mover. So that first mover has to be unmoved, right? It has to be different from everything else in the sequence. And this we understand to be God. Good. And then the second one, causation. Very good. So just like we observe motion, just like we observe contingency, perfection, harmony, we observe cause and effect, right? And just like that, causation cannot go back infinitely. There has to have been a first cause that itself was uncaused. Otherwise, it too would require an explanation. So that uncaused cause must exist, and we understand that to be God. So in the PowerPoint, I give you lots of different I give you detailed formulations of each one. But again, I want us to focus on the third way, right? Using that reductio strategy. And I want you to note the differences between that and the positive formulation, right? So there are two ways we can formulate it, but that reductio strategy is a really useful strategy when we're dealing with claims that we cannot prove. Okay, so if you're ever dealing with, like, if someone's trying to argue, how do you argue that like something doesn't exist? Like, how are you, if you want to argue that ghosts don't exist, right? Well, maybe you can't argue that something doesn't exist, but you can argue through reductio, right? That it would be problematic to assume that they do, right? So it's a very useful strategy. If you're ever unable to give direct support for something, this is a roundabout way of doing it. So very useful tool to learn logically. Right? And the important thing is that, again, it relies on something absurd, right? Or some sort of contradiction or something that is false, right? Which gives us reason to reject it. All right, so now let's go through each line of the argument, right? So we want to assess potential and imagine potential problems with the argument, right? And again, even if we accept this argument, we still want to imagine critiques. Why do we want to do that? Why do we want to critique arguments that we agree with? What's the value of that? Who can remember? Exactly, right? You're not going to be able to handle those objections from someone else unless you have first imagined them yourself, right? And prepared a response. Okay, so we imagine any potential objections so that we can prepare against them. Or if we're like, oh, dang, that objection is really good, maybe we need to change our position, right? And come up with something stronger. So this is what philosophers do, right? It's what these natural theologians did, right? They imagined criticisms to these ideas. And this is another thing that's, I think, really fascinating about Thomas Aquinas, is that what he wrote was not like for the average believer, right? Or for scholars in just secular academia. It was for priests. It was for people who were going to be dealing with the questions and the doubts of their practitioners. This was how they were supposed to respond. He was giving them philosophical arguments as tools to say, this is how you explain these complicated things to your flock, right? To the people who come to you with these answers, right? So the idea is that it's valuable, especially for those who believe, right? To be able to make sense of these ideas, of these concepts. Right. And so it's a sort of manual in that regard. And so looking at these different arguments, right, different ways of making sense of how we can move just from looking at the world in front of you, which I think, again, is something maybe you've seen a lot of people do. Like, have you ever talked to someone who believes in God and they're like, just look at it, right? Just open your eyes.
That's my mother.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Like you might feel like there's no substance in that, but there's so much that they're trying to convey, right? When they're just pointing to the observations of the world. And so us being able to explore exactly what those observations are is supposed to tell us something about the kind of being that created it, right? So what do we think about this initial statement that the world is contingent? Do you think that the universe is contingent, or could it itself be the necessary thing? Let me think. This is a tough question. I mean, it's right. This goes to almost questions like, do you think time is linear or circular, right? So there's a lot of science that goes into a question like this, right? Do you think that there have always been something? There's always been something, right? That's what most physics tells us, that matter is neither created nor destroyed. Right? There has to have been something at the time of the Big Bang that collided into it, right? Like there has to have been something, but what was it and where did it come from, right? So this need to come up with where it all started. Is that need legitimate? Or is it possibly the case that stuff has always existed, or there have been many Big Bangs, right? Maybe you have a version like that fits with multiverse, right? Or something like this. There are lots of different ways we can see it, but think about what it means for you. What is your observation of the world, right? Is it something that requires something outside of it for its explanation, right? Or is it potentially self-explanatory? Again, that is not for me to decide to tell you, right? I know a little bit about science, but again, there's still a lot that science doesn't know, right? So how are we filling in those gaps in our knowledge? Okay. Then the idea is that, okay, if we do accept that the universe is contingent, okay, at least accept that, then we have to ask ourselves about that second characteristic of cosmological arguments. Do we really think that an infinite regress is impossible? Right? If you're into math, there's lots of counterexamples, right? So one of the main reasons why Aquinas thinks that an infinite regress is impossible is because he says it's incomprehensible. But I don't know about you, I can comprehend an infinite regress. Like if I can comprehend something going forward infinitely, I feel pretty confident I have a grasp of it going backwards infinitely too, right? We do this with numbers all the time, right? You guys know numbers go in both directions forever, right?
Yeah.
And there are other fun thought experiments like Hilbert's infinite hotel, right? Like imagine an infinite hotel and it's housing the infinite soccer team. And so everyone is checked into the infinite hotel, but then there's one new member to the soccer team. And so everyone has to move down one room. Like we can always imagine more, right? Like we can always keep it going. And so in that respect, it does seem comprehensible, right? And then we too have to decide again, where is God in relationship to these things going on, right? So it's not always clear. There are a lot of questions here, some fun mathy things to consider, right? But we have to ask ourselves, is the universe contingent, right? Does it require something outside of itself for its existence? And is an infinite regress of whatever, right? Causation, motion, contingency, whatever it is that really impossible? Because if it's not impossible, right, then we might ask what role God has, right? Again, in relationship to the existence of that thing. And again, we do seem to have conceptions like infinite sets in math, right? So we can even conceive of multiple infinities, right? So we just want to think of the reasons we're accepting certain things. Okay, so if you think that an infinite regress is impossible, why then is it impossible? I think the reductio is a better one, right? Like if we can't go back, right, there's no first thing, how do we get to where we are now? That's a great question. Right? I don't know that just saying it's incomprehensible is satisfactory because it seems like we can comprehend it in quite a number of different ways. Good. Okay. So other potential objections that you'll see is again, of course, with the natural theologian jump at the end, right? Why does that necessary being have to be God, right? Why does it have to be only one God, right? Or why does it have to be the Abrahamic conception of God? So this is something that we're going to see from David Hume, right? More so when we get to the teleological argument, but they do a similar jump at the end, right? And the idea there is that, you know, when we look at the creation and we think that that's supposed to tell us something about the creator, well, if the creation isn't perfect, why should we think the creator is perfect, right? So again, if we're attributing things to the creator based on the creation, we might not be able to arrive at the Abrahamic conception of God as easily as some of these theologians want us to think. Okay, so just think about these things. That doesn't mean that we have to throw out these arguments, right? Maybe we need to modify them, strengthen them, right? Come up with better reasons, update them, right? Again, these are old now. These are very outdated. So how can we adjust these things? And so you're going to see versions of figures trying to do that, right? Trying to argue for updated conceptions of God, but also we're going to see some more critiques of that. And a lot of it is going to be based in science and what we've learned from that. So Paul Edwards is going to give you a really thorough critique of the idea that an infinite regress is impossible, right? And one of the things that's going to be set up or rested upon a lot for cosmological arguments is something called the principle of sufficient reason. Right? And so this is the idea that for anything that exists, okay, it must have a necessary and sufficient explanation for its existence. Right? And so we want to figure out not only what the necessary existence is for the universe, right? What was needed for the universe to exist, but also what's just enough, what's just sufficient, right, to explain that. And this is important because, as you're going to see, for some people, we don't need to explain the beginning, right? So if for a principle of sufficient reason, if sufficiency for you is explaining part of the story and not the whole story, then you've met that criteria. Right. And so they're going to give you something called the 5 Eskimos example. Right. And this is the idea. How do we explain how the Eskimos got to New York? Right. And the idea is, well, I don't have to explain how the first Eskimo got there. Right. It's enough to use each person and just explain why the person before them. Right. Just to explain the cause before. I don't need to go back all the way to the beginning. Right. So this again is, how far back does your knowledge, does your ability to discern truth need to go? Do you need to go back all the way to the beginning to get a sufficient explanation for why something exists now? And again, that too is not something I can answer for you. This is a matter of intellectual satisfaction. You do get to decide for yourself. But all important questions, right? What is enough to explain why things exist now? Good. Then we're going to see another version of the cosmological argument known as the Kalam cosmological argument. And this name is redundant because Kalam in Arabic just means cosmological. So it's the cosmological argument. But that's what happens when white people use other words that are outside of English. They get redundant. So William Lane Craig, who is a prominent Christian theologian, uses this Islamic philosophical argument from religion to make sense of this, right? So he's going to try to say, okay, maybe we don't need to deny an infinite regress. So he's going to put God, this is again that question of where God resides in time, right? Does God have to be the first thing there at the beginning of the chain, or can God just be the necessary creator outside of that set of infinite things, right? So it's a way of trying to avoid some of these critiques, right? Again, this is why we imagine criticism so that we can respond to them, right? So he's saying, look, even if you think that an infinite regress is possible, we can still arrive at God's existence from this, right? So that's going to be the Kalam cosmological argument, right? And so we'll see an assessment of that in the PowerPoint. And then again, David Hume's final critique, which I will emphasize rests on his epistemological view, known as empiricism, right? And so this is the idea that knowledge is only a posteriori, right? We can only arrive at knowledge of things after experience, but even that doesn't get us all the a posteriori knowledge that the cosmological argument is getting after. And so according to Hume, this is a type of skepticism, the contingency, the causation, right? All of these presumptions that are being made that we're observing about the world, Hume is going to question those, right? So he's going to question the notion of cause and effect, right? Do you actually see causation? Is that something you experience in the world? You experience an event followed by another event, right? And then through past experience, you maybe learn to associate those things together, right? So like if I strike a match, right, on a box, you expect there to be a certain cause. But just because I've grown to expect that relationship between cause and effect, does that mean it's necessarily going to happen? If I strike the match, am I guaranteed to get a flame? No, right? Because I'm not actually witnessing the science, right? I'm not actually able, my eyes are not able to capture the combustion, right? The physics that are going on. Maybe, there's not enough, it's been worn down, right? There's not enough friction to get the spark going, or it was damp, or what, some other millions of things, right, that could have happened. The idea, though, is that maybe we're even postulating too much about what we think we're observing in the world from Hume, right? So we can't just say that every effect has a cause, right? And again, this is what's really radical about his view, is that it ends up being really consistent with things like quantum physics, right? So one of the strongest scientific counterexamples to the cosmological argument is that we literally see things that just pop into and out of existence now on a quantum level, and we don't know what is going on. We don't know what's causing them. We don't know where they're going when they cease to exist here. Like, there's just so much unknown there, right? And so he's sort of picking up on that, like, just because you see something, yes, our past experience has taught us that there's typically a cause, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the case, right? So lots and lots of things to consider here. All right, so we have about 7 minutes left of class. Any questions about any of these views that you're going to be reading for this week? All right, so we have Aquinas, we have Edwards, we have Hume, we have, who did I forget? Craig? Yes. All right, so I'll leave us with a final little anecdote about Hume. He's like the philosopher's philosopher, if you're curious. And so he has this funny line, because he's a skeptic, obviously, but he has to make his way through the world. So even though we can't always rely on past experience, right, doesn't guarantee things about the future, he does say, like, I'm still going to get out of the way of a running horse, right? Like, it still seems to work, this type of reasoning. But the point is that it's inductive. It doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion like they're setting it out to, right? These arguments are meant to be deductive. They're meant to show that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow. And his point here is that, look, even if the universe is contingent, that doesn't necessarily mean, right, that we have to deny an infinite regress, or that there has to be a different cause outside of itself, right? We've presumed a lot, right, about the nature of contingent beings and causality and so forth in these arguments. And so that's going to be the crux of Hume's critique. But again, doesn't mean it doesn't always work. It's just inductive reasoning. It doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. All right, well, I'll hang out for the next 5 minutes or so. For next week, I'm just going to tell you I have the cable people coming on Monday, so Hopefully everything will be set up by Tuesday. But of course, I'll let you know if anything is otherwise. But thank you for bearing with me this past couple weeks. I hope you all enjoy the weekend. Stay safe out there. Enjoy some sun if you're able to. Thank you. Any other questions I can answer for anybody? Thank you. Close. We lost it a little bit in that last connection, but you were right up to the point there. So
Right.
yeah, the idea is we can imagine a being than which no greater being is more, right? So we can imagine the most perfect being, right?
Yeah.
The idea is exactly like you said, real existence is much more perfect than just imaginative existence. And so if we can imagine a most perfect being, that being must actually exist, right? Because by definition of being perfect, it would have to have the best kind of existence. And the best kind of existence is not just in our imagination, but is in the world. Yeah, I actually think there's a really fascinating updated version of this argument that deals with possible worlds, which again is also very consistent with multiverse theory. And so the
Hmm.
idea is that if if there are possible worlds, the idea is that there's a world for every possibility, right? And
Hmm.
so then there, of course, is a possible world where a necessary being exists, right? It's
Yeah.
possible, so there is one. But the thing about necessary existence is that if you exist in one possible world, you exist in all of them. So again, right, it's not always like we'll get rid of the old, but like maybe we just need to update, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of these arguments have been updated, right? So yeah, but
Yeah.
we want to understand like the different variations, right? How it started, how we can change it to make it better. Because again, we're still seeing versions of the old arguments around
Right.
today. Yeah.